The day my husband emptied our savings account, he thought I would cry. Instead, I smiled. After 38 years of marriage, I knew Gregory Payne far better than he thought. When I saw the notification that every single dime had been drained from our joint account, I didn't panic. I didn't get angry. I wasn't even surprised, because months ago I had already moved the real money. Gregory thought he had won. He thought he had finally taken everything we built together. But as he celebrated his victory, he had no idea that his biggest mistake wasn't stealing my money. It was underestimating me. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If stories of family drama and justice resonate with you, please like and subscribe. Before we go any further, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is over there. I always love seeing how many people from different places connect through these stories. My name is Theresa Payne, and at 62 years old, I thought I knew exactly who my husband was. Looking back,
I realized that was my very first mistake.
When people hear a story like mine, they usually assume there were obvious warning signs from the very beginning. They picture a marriage filled with endless fighting, secrets, and unhappiness. But that wasn't our story. At least, not for a very, very long time. I met Gregory Payne when I was 23. I was working as a junior accountant for a small manufacturing company just outside Columbus, Ohio. Gregory was charming, confident, and funny. He worked for a shipping logistics company, and he had this way of making everyone around him feel like the most important person in the room. The first time we talked, he made me laugh so hard I spilled coffee all over my desk. I was mortified. He just beamed. That was Gregory back then. He made life feel light. We dated for 2 years before getting married. Neither of us came from money. We rented a tiny apartment with thin walls and a furnace that only worked when it felt like it. That first winter together, we huddled under so many blankets, we joked they were permanent fixtures. We were struggling, but we were struggling together, and that's what made it beautiful. When Gregory lost his job during an economic downturn, I worked overtime. When I needed surgery in my 30s, Gregory took care of everything. When our daughter Ashley was born, we spent years balancing bills, daycare costs, and endless responsibilities. Sometimes at the end of the month, we didn't even have enough left to go out for a cheap dinner. But somehow, we always found a way. For decades, I believed we were partners. Real partners. The kind of couple that survives because they have each other's backs. Because of my accounting background, I handled most of our finances. Gregory preferred it that way. He always joked that numbers gave him a headache. Every paycheck was deposited, every bill was paid on time, and every penny was accounted for. We built our life carefully, slowly, and responsibly. We bought a modest house in a quiet neighborhood. Nothing extravagant, nothing flashy, just a comfortable home where we raised our daughter and built a lifetime of memories. Ashley was the center of our universe. Like any mother, I sacrificed things for her that she will never even know about. Vacations, new clothes, personal dreams. I don't regret a single bit of it. Seeing her grow into a successful woman made every sacrifice worth it. By the time Gregory and I reached our late 50s, life seemed to settle into a predictable routine. Ashley had moved out and started her career. Gregory was nearing retirement. I started picturing a quiet future. Weekend trips, lazy mornings, and maybe a small cottage by the lake one day. Nothing dramatic, nothing complicated, just peace. But somewhere along the way, things began to shift. It didn't happen all at once. That's the terrifying thing about betrayal. It doesn't arrive with a grand announcement. It creeps in on silent feet. At first, Gregory just seemed distracted. He spent more time on his phone. He stared at the screen during dinner. Sometimes I'd be halfway through a story, only to realize he wasn't even listening. "Sorry," he'd say. "What were you saying?" They were small things, easily forgiven. Then came the late nights. Gregory started volunteering for projects at work, or so he told me. Meetings ran later. Traffic was always worse. Sudden business dinners became a regular occurrence. And once again, I believed him. Why wouldn't I? This was my husband. The man I had trusted for nearly 40 years. The man who had been there for every major moment of my life. The man who held my hand when my mother passed away. The man who sat next to me when Ashley left for college. The man who promised me that no matter what happened, we would face it as a team. You don't just wake up one morning and decide a man like that is a liar. At least I didn't. Not yet. One evening, I noticed something unusual. Gregory was smiling at his phone. It wasn't a casual smile, not the kind you give a funny text from a friend. This was different. It looked surprisingly young, excited, and full of anticipation. When he realized I was looking, he quickly locked his screen. A strange sensation twisted in my stomach. I couldn't explain why. Nothing had happened. There was no proof, no evidence, just an instinct. Women my age usually learn to trust those instincts. They come from experience, from years of noticing the details other people miss. Still, I pushed the thought away. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself that long marriages go through different phases. I told myself it was just the stress of upcoming retirement. I told myself a lot of things, and most of them were wrong. A few weeks later, Ashley came over to visit. We spent the afternoon together while Gregory watched television in the living room. At one point, Ashley looked over at her father and frowned. "Dad seems different lately." The comment caught me off guard. I hadn't said a word to her. "What do you mean?" I asked. She shrugged. "I don't know. He just seems distant." For a split second, I felt a wave of relief. Maybe I wasn't crazy. Maybe someone else noticed it too. But then Ashley laughed. "He's probably just getting old." I laughed along and agreed. The conversation ended, but her words stayed with me. Different. That was the exact word. Gregory wasn't angry. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't openly unhappy. He was just becoming a stranger. And that was far more terrifying than any argument we could have ever had. One Saturday morning, I woke up earlier than usual. The house was completely still. The sun was streaming through the kitchen window. I brewed a pot of coffee and sat alone at the table. Gregory finally came downstairs. He looked tired and distracted, his mind clearly a million miles away. I asked him if everything was okay. He smiled instantly, a little too quickly, like he had practiced it. "Everything's perfect." Then he kissed my forehead and changed the subject. The moment lasted less than 10 seconds. But years later, I can still see it perfectly, because that was the first time I felt a physical wall between us. It wasn't a disagreement or a misunderstanding. It was an invisible, solid wall. And once I noticed it, I started seeing it everywhere. The way he guarded his phone, the way he avoided eye contact, the way he grew impatient whenever I talked about the future, about retirement, about money, about our plans. I didn't know it then, but Gregory was already making choices that would alter both of our lives forever. While I was still trying to nurture our marriage, he was quietly preparing for something else entirely. The very thing that would lead him to empty our savings account. The very thing that would force me to protect myself. The very thing that would reveal who the man I loved for 38 years truly was. I just didn't know it yet. Once you start noticing a change in someone, you can't unsee it. It's like a camera lens snapping into focus. Details that used to seem completely harmless suddenly stand out with uncomfortable clarity. The first major warning sign was his phone. For almost 4 decades, Gregory treated his phone like any other object. He'd leave it on the kitchen counter, the coffee table, or the bathroom sink. Then, practically overnight, it became an extension of his hand. He took it everywhere. If he walked into the next room, the phone went with him. If he went outside to take out the trash, the phone went with him. Even when he took a shower, he kept it close enough to hear the notifications. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Everyone seems glued to their screens these days. But then the passcode changed. For years, I knew every single one of Gregory's passwords. Not because I wanted to check up on him, but because we had nothing to hide. One evening, I picked up his phone to check the weather forecast, while my own phone was charging in the other room. The screen lit up, asking for a passcode I didn't recognize. I stared at it. That had never happened before. When Gregory walked back into the room, I asked him about it casually. "Oh," he said quickly, his eyes darting away. "Company policy. They wanted tighter security on personal devices." The explanation sounded reasonable enough, but his reaction didn't. He looked incredibly tense. It wasn't guilt, not yet. Just nerves. like he had been expecting the question, like he had practiced the answer. A few days later, another small crack appeared. I was folding laundry in the bedroom when Gregory's phone buzzed on the dresser. The screen lit up briefly. I wasn't trying to snoop. In fact, I was about to look away. But something caught my eye. A name. It wasn't a co-worker I recognized. It was just a single first name. Vanessa. Before I could see anything else, the message vanished. My stomach tightened. When Gregory came back into the room, he checked his phone immediately, and then he smiled. It was that exact same smile I had noticed weeks earlier. The young smile, the excited smile, the smile that didn't belong to me anymore. I didn't say a word. Not because I wasn't worried, but because I wasn't ready for the explanation he would inevitably give. Deep down, I think I already knew the answer. I just wasn't ready to face it. Over the next month, Gregory's schedule became increasingly erratic. He started working late multiple times a week. Business dinners appeared on the calendar with unusual frequency. Weekend meetings suddenly became unavoidable. The excuses were endless, and unfortunately, they sounded completely plausible on the surface. After all, Gregory had spent decades building a reputation as a responsible, hard-working man. A lie hidden inside 1,000 truths is incredibly difficult to spot. One Friday night, he called to say he'd be home late. There was a shipping delay at the warehouse, a logistical headache, nothing out of the ordinary. I accepted it. Around 9 o'clock that evening, I decided to order some takeout. While logging into our online bank account to check a balance, I noticed a charge I didn't recognize. It was from a restaurant, not just any restaurant, but one of the most expensive dining spots in downtown Columbus. The bill was well over $200, easily a dinner for two. My first thought was simple. Maybe it was a business dinner, but it felt wrong. Gregory rarely spent that kind of money, even when entertaining clients. When he finally got home, I casually asked about his evening. How did the shipping issue turn out? The question slipped out before I could stop myself. For a fraction of a second, Gregory froze. It wasn't long enough for most people to notice, but I did. Then he smiled. Total nightmare. He launched into a detailed story involving schedules, drivers, and mechanical failures. It was a flawless story, except for one thing. Absolutely nothing in his explanation required a trip to a high-end restaurant. I didn't press him. I just listened. That night, as he slept soundly beside me, I stared at the ceiling. For the first time in 38 years, I had to accept that my husband was lying to my face. The thought felt almost impossible, like questioning gravity or my own reflection. Yet once the doubt crawled in, it refused to leave. The next morning, I began to pay closer attention. Not spying, just observing. There's a distinct difference between the two. I wasn't trying to trap Gregory. I was trying to understand why our entire life suddenly felt completely off balance. Over the next few weeks, more unusual expenses started appearing. Hotel charges, restaurant bills, and gas station visits that didn't match his stated locations. None of them were definitive on their own, but together they formed a pattern. And patterns are incredibly hard for an accountant to ignore. One afternoon, I opened a blank notebook and started writing things down. Dates, amounts, explanations, and locations. That notebook wasn't evidence. Not yet. It was just a way to organize my thoughts. A way to see if my fears were real or just my imagination. Unfortunately, the more data I gathered, the worse it looked. The stories didn't add up. The timelines didn't match. The expenses didn't make sense. Most importantly, Gregory didn't make sense. The man sitting across from me at dinner didn't act like the husband I had known for decades. He was distant, irritable, and occasionally angry for no reason at all. When I brought up retirement plans, he changed the subject. When I mentioned a future vacation, he barely responded. When I suggested spending more time together, he suddenly had somewhere else to be. One night I finally asked him directly, "Are you happy, Gregory?" The question caught him completely off guard. "Of course I am." I studied his face. "Are you sure?" He offered a strained laugh. "Theresa, everything is fine." But his eyes completely contradicted his words. I realized an important truth in that moment. I wasn't the only one pretending. Gregory was pretending too. Pretending everything was normal, pretending we were still the same couple, pretending there wasn't a massive, widening canyon between us. The only difference was I had no idea why he was doing it. A few days later, I hit the moment that changed everything. I was sorting through old paperwork in our home office and stumbled upon a recent credit card statement we shared. Most of the charges were entirely familiar. Groceries, utilities, household items. Then I noticed something completely out of character. A hotel reservation for 2 nights over a weekend when Gregory was supposed to be attending a logistics conference. The hotel wasn't anywhere near the convention centre. In fact, it was nearly 40 miles away. I checked the conference schedule online. The dates matched perfectly. The location didn't. My heart hammered against my ribs. I leaned back slowly in my chair. For several minutes, I just stared at that statement. I wasn't angry yet. I was completely broken because deep down, I knew exactly what I was looking at. It wasn't absolute proof, but it was close enough. The existence of another woman was no longer a vague fear. It was a terrifying reality. That evening, Gregory came home holding a bouquet of flowers. Beautiful flowers. The kind he used to buy when we were first married. Years ago, that gesture would have made me smile. This time, it made my skin crawl. He kissed my cheek, handed me the bouquet, and asked how my day was. Everything looked entirely normal. Yet somehow it felt more artificial than ever. As I placed the flowers in a vase, I realized something that scared me far more than a hotel bill. Gregory wasn't just hiding a secret. He was actively working to ensure I never found out. And people only try that hard when they have something massive to lose. I didn't know who Vanessa was. I didn't know how long she had been in his life. I didn't know how far Gregory was willing to go. But I was beginning to understand that the man I loved was harboring secrets far larger than I ever could have imagined. For nearly 2 weeks after finding that hotel bill, I lived in a state of quiet suspension. I still didn't have definitive proof, only questions. The kind of questions that follow you into every room. The kind that sit next to you at breakfast and keep you awake at night. The kind that whisper in the silence every time your husband looks away too quickly or smiles at his phone. Part of me wanted to confront him immediately. Another part was absolutely terrified of what I might find out. After 38 years of marriage, the truth felt far more dangerous than suspicion, because suspicion still leaves room for hope. The truth doesn't. One Tuesday morning, I was sorting through files in the home office when my phone rang. A familiar name appeared on the screen. Linda Brooks. I smiled automatically. Linda and I had known each other for nearly 20 years. She worked at the local bank, where Gregory and I kept our primary accounts. Over the years, our relationship had grown far beyond basic customer service. We had attended retirement parties together, shared lunches, and exchanged Christmas cards. I picked up, expecting a casual chat. Instead, her voice sounded unusually tense. "Theresa, do you have a quick minute?" The tone immediately set off alarms. "Of course, what's up?" There was a brief pause. Not the kind where someone forgets what they're saying, but the heavy pause of someone trying to decide exactly how much to reveal. Finally, Linda spoke. "I'm calling you strictly as a friend right now." A cold dread washed over me. Those 10 words changed everything. People rarely start a conversation that way unless something is deeply wrong. I sat down slowly. "What's going on, Linda?" Another pause. "I have to be incredibly careful here, Theresa." I understood instantly. Because of her position at the bank, Linda couldn't legally discuss confidential account information. I had worked in finance long enough to know the boundaries, but she wouldn't have called unless she was seriously worried. "Linda," I said, keeping my voice as calm as possible, "just tell me what you can." She dropped her voice to a whisper. "Have you and Gregory discussed making any major financial changes or shifts lately?" My heart skipped a beat. "No, not at all." The silence that followed felt endless. Then she sighed. "Theresa, I can't give you specifics. You know I can't." "I know. But if I were in your position, I would look very, very closely at all of your financial documents right now." I felt my stomach drop. "Why?" She measured her words with extreme caution. "Let's just say Gregory has been asking a lot of highly specific questions lately. Questions, not transactions. not movements. Just questions. Yet somehow that felt even more sinister because questions meant planning. It meant preparation and intent. What kind of questions, Linda? I can't answer that, sweetie. Her voice softened. But if I were you, I wouldn't wait too long to double-check everything. Everything. The word echoed in my mind. We spoke for another minute before hanging up. Neither of us mentioned the obvious truth staring us in the face. We didn't need to. The warning had been delivered. After the call ended, I sat entirely motionless at my desk, staring out the window for a long time. The world outside looked completely normal. Cars drove past, birds landed on the fence, and neighbours walked their dogs. Yet something fundamental had completely shifted. Until that exact moment, a part of me was still desperately holding on to innocent explanations. Maybe Gregory was just unhappy, or struggling with aging, or facing retirement anxiety. Now, a completely different picture came into view. What if this wasn't just an emotional distance? What if Gregory was actively preparing to take something from me? That afternoon, I began pulling out financial records, tax returns, investment statements, retirement accounts, banking documents, insurance policies, everything. As an accountant, years of experience had taught me one undeniable lesson. Numbers rarely lie, but people do. The more documents I reviewed, the more uneasy I became. At first glance, nothing looked glaringly wrong. The bills were paid on time, the accounts were active, and the balances matched expectations. However, tiny inconsistencies began to surface. Subtle details that most people would look right past. Transfers between accounts that seemed unnecessary. Withdrawals without clear explanations. Shifting transaction patterns. Nothing illegal. Nothing explicitly wrong. Just unusual. The deeper I dug, the more uncomfortable I felt. Several nights passed just like that. Gregory would sit in the living room watching television while I quietly audited our records in the office. He never once asked what I was doing. That alone felt bizarre. For most of our marriage, Gregory was naturally curious. Now he seemed almost relieved that my time was occupied. One evening, I closed a folder and leaned back, a dark realization solidifying in my mind. The man I had trusted with my life was likely planning something behind my back. The thought made me physically sick. I walked into the kitchen to pour a glass of water, and Gregory looked up from his phone. "Are you doing okay, honey?" The question sounded entirely genuine, and that was the most confusing part. Gregory's behavior didn't fit neatly into a single category. Sometimes he was distant, sometimes affectionate, sometimes guilty, and sometimes completely ordinary. I nodded, just tired. He smiled. "You've been spending a lot of time buried in paperwork lately." My pulse quickened. There it was. The first real question. The first sign that he was paying attention. "Just doing some spring cleaning," I replied. He chuckled. "Only an accountant would call auditing financial records spring cleaning." I forced a smile, but inside, a loud warning siren was blaring. I spent the rest of the night replaying that short conversation. Gregory hadn't asked what I was doing. He had asked why. There was a massive difference. For the first time, I wondered if he was watching me just as closely as I was watching him. The next morning, I called Michael Turner. I'd known Michael professionally for years. He specialized in estate planning and financial asset protection. There was nothing dramatic about it, no mention of divorce, at least not yet. I used the excuse of reviewing our retirement plans to schedule a consultation. Technically, it wasn't even a lie. I desperately needed expert advice. 2 days later, I sat across from him in his office. After handling the routine updates, I finally told him the truth. Not all of it, just enough. The suspicious behavior, the financial red flags, and my growing dread. Michael listened intently, carving his fingers together as I finished. "What is your ultimate goal here, Theresa?" The question caught me off guard. "I don't know." It was the honest truth. Part of me wanted reassurance, part of me wanted protection, and part of me just wanted someone to tell me it was all in my head.
Instead, Michael asked another question. Do you trust your husband completely?
The answer should have been simple. For 38 years it always had been. Now the words caught in my throat. The silence told him everything he needed to know. He nodded slowly. "Then you need to prepare yourself for every single possibility. Every single possibility. Those words stayed with me long after I left his office, because every single possibility included outcomes I desperately didn't want to consider. Infidelity, financial betrayal, divorce, and the complete collapse of my life. That night, I sat alone on the back porch watching the sun go down. For the first time in months, I stopped focusing entirely on Gregory. Instead, I focused on myself. What would happen if my fears were right? What would happen if the marriage ended? What would happen if Gregory tried to drain the assets we built together? The questions were painful, but absolutely necessary. As I sat there, another epiphany surfaced. Protecting myself didn't mean giving up on my marriage. Preparation isn't betrayal. Preparation is responsibility. Especially for a woman in her 60s, especially after a lifetime of hard work, and especially when the warning signs are appearing much faster than the explanations. I made a firm decision that night. I wasn't going to confront Gregory. It wasn't time yet. I wouldn't accuse him or reveal my suspicions. Instead, I would quietly gather information, quietly safeguard my assets, and quietly prepare. Because if Gregory truly was planning something, the absolute worst thing I could do was reveal my hand too early. I still hoped I was completely wrong. I still prayed there was an innocent explanation. But deep down, a voice was telling me the truth. And as time passed, the truth became impossible to ignore. I didn't know it then, but Linda's phone call would ultimately save me hundreds of thousands of dollars. Because Gregory wasn't just asking questions. He was executing a plan. And very soon, his actions would force me to execute a plan of my own. The strange thing about preparing for a potential betrayal is that you never feel completely right doing it. Every step feels like a tiny act of unfaithfulness. Every precaution feels like a baseless accusation, even when the evidence is piling up right in front of your face. For days after my meeting with Michael, I wrestled with immense guilt. I wasn't hiding money, I wasn't planning revenge, and I wasn't even planning a divorce. I was simply trying to understand my legal options. Yet, after nearly 40 years of marriage, taking steps to protect myself felt unnatural, as if I was somehow breaking the vows I had spent my entire life honoring. But I couldn't ignore one critical piece of reality. Not all of our money belonged to Gregory and me, equally, and that distinction was about to become absolutely vital. 3 years before my mother passed away, she invited me out for lunch. At the time, I thought it was just a normal visit. Instead, it turned into one of the most important conversations of my life. My mother had always been fiercely practical. She wasn't wealthy or flashy, but she understood the value of a safety net. After dessert, she handed me a manila folder containing financial documents I had never seen before. Savings accounts, certificates of deposit, and investment records. I remember staring at them in shock. "Mum, what is all this?"
She smiled gently. "This is what I've quietly set aside over the years, Theresa."
I was stunned. My mother rarely spoke about money, not because she liked secrets, but because she believed actions spoke far louder than words. When she finally passed, the inheritance wasn't massive by corporate standards, but it was substantial, nearly $200,000. Money she spent decades protecting. Money she left specifically to me. Not to Gregory, not to anyone else, just to me. At the time, Gregory actually encouraged me to keep the money separate. Ironically, it was his idea. "I don't think your mother would want that money tangled up in everything else, dear," he had said back then. At the time, I took it as a sign of deep respect. Maybe it was. Maybe at one point he truly meant it. Whatever his reasons, I took his advice. The inheritance remained in a separate account, solely under my name. Over the years, I invested it carefully. Nothing high risk or aggressive, just steady mutual funds and conservative, retirement-focused growth. Having an accounting background, I understood the power of patience. Money doesn't need miracles. It needs time. And time had been incredibly generous to those investments. By the time I turned 62, that inheritance had grown to a value far beyond its original amount. It wasn't enough to make headlines, but it was enough to provide total security, enough to alter my future.
And enough to make a critical difference.
Here is the important part. Gregory knew the inheritance existed, but he had absolutely no idea how much it had grown. He never asked, and over the years I stopped volunteering the details. Not because I was keeping secrets, but simply because he never showed an interest. His focus was always on our joint checking, our house, and our shared retirement accounts. The inheritance became practically invisible to him, and as it turned out, that was an incredible stroke of luck. A week after my consultation with Michael, I went back to his office. This time, our conversation was much more tactical. I explained the inheritance, the separate investments, and my growing dread over Gregory's recent behavior. Michael listened carefully, reviewing the documents. After nearly an hour, he leaned back in his leather chair. Theresa, from a legal standpoint, you did an excellent job keeping these assets entirely segregated. The words brought an immediate wave of relief. Meaning? Meaning they can still be clearly identified as your separate non-marital property. I nodded. That had been entirely intentional. Over the years, I had resisted the temptation to merge everything, largely because of my mother's explicit request. Now that decision looked wiser than ever. Michael continued, if you are concerned about a future financial dispute, now is the time to audit everything meticulously. A future financial dispute. What a polite professional way to describe a complete disaster. When I left his office, I sat in my car for nearly 20 minutes, processing the reality of what was happening. For the very first time, I was actively preparing for a future that might not include Gregory. The thought broke my heart. It's hard to explain, even now. People assume that betrayal automatically destroys love. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes love lingers long after trust has died. I still loved the man I thought Gregory was. I just wasn't sure that man existed anymore. Over the next month, I quietly reviewed every single financial account connected to my future. Not our future, but mine. The distinction felt painful, but it was necessary. I met with advisors, updated records, verified beneficiaries, and reviewed retirement projections. Everything was handled completely legally, transparently, and properly. Yet I told almost no one, not even Ashley. Especially not Ashley, because I still desperately hoped that all of this would turn out to be completely unnecessary. I still wanted Gregory to come to me, confess whatever was bothering him, explain the strange behavior, and tell me I had it all wrong. But he never did. Instead, the distance between us only grew. One evening, I sat across from him at dinner while the television murmured in the background. We ate in complete silence for the most part. Finally, I brought up retirement again. What do you think you'll want to do once you stop working, Gregory? He barely looked up from his plate. I don't know. The answer stunned me. For years, Gregory talked about retirement constantly. Fishing trips, travelling, golf, driving across the country. Now he seemed entirely indifferent. Or maybe those dreams just didn't include me anymore. The possibility hurt far more than I cared to admit. Late that night, while Gregory slept, I sat alone in the office, reviewing investment statements. The screen was filled with rows of numbers. Years of discipline, years of sacrifice, years of planning. Suddenly I thought of my mother. I remembered that lunch, the folder, and our conversation. I remembered her saying, "Never let anyone convince you that protecting yourself is selfish, Theresa." At the time, I barely understood her meaning. Now those words felt like a prophecy. For weeks, I had wrestled with immense guilt. Guilt for preparing, guilt for questioning, guilt for protecting myself. Yet the truth was simple. I hadn't created this situation. Gregory had. I hadn't broken the trust. Someone else already had. That realization changed something fundamental inside me. It wasn't a dramatic overnight shift, but it was enough. It was enough to replace the guilt with pure resolve. Enough to help me stop apologizing for being cautious, and enough to make me take an extra step. The most important step came 2 weeks later. After another meeting with Michael, I made a quiet decision that Gregory would never notice. At least, not right away. I began shifting a portion of my individual investments into structures that offered an extra layer of protection and oversight. Everything was fully documented, legal and completely traceable, but significantly more secure. If a dispute arose in the future, those assets would no longer be vulnerable to confusion or manipulation. As I signed the final paperwork, an unexpected feeling washed over me. Peace. Not happiness, and certainly not victory, just peace. For the first time in months, I felt entirely prepared. Whatever Gregory was planning, I wouldn't be caught off guard. Whatever secrets existed, I would survive them. Whatever came next, my mother's legacy was completely protected. What I didn't know was that things were moving much faster than I anticipated. Far faster. Because while I was quietly securing my own future, Gregory was becoming increasingly reckless. Somewhere outside our marriage, the other woman was beginning to play a far larger role than I ever could have imagined. A woman named Vanessa. A woman who would soon turn my suspicions into undeniable facts. For months, Vanessa had been nothing more than a name. A word flashing briefly on a phone screen. A mystery. A shadow of a fear. But after discovering so much, I couldn't ignore that name any longer. I needed answers. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I needed the absolute truth. The problem is, when someone is determined to hide the truth, it can be surprisingly difficult to find. By this point, Gregory had become incredibly careful. His phone never left his side, receipts vanished, schedules were vague, and explanations were perfectly rehearsed. If there was another woman, he wasn't making the evidence easy to find. One night, after another late arrival, I sat alone in the office staring at my notebook. The pages were filled with dates, amounts, and observations, patterns, doubts, and worries. Yet I still lacked absolute certainty. The uncertainty was completely exhausting. I wasn't sleeping, I couldn't focus, and I lived in a constant state of waiting for the next clue, the next inconsistency, the next lie. Finally, I reached a point where I couldn't tolerate the limbo any longer. The following week, I made a choice I never thought I'd have to make. I hired a private investigator. Even now, saying those words out loud feels entirely surreal. Private investigators belong in movies, not in my life. Not in the life of a 62-year-old accountant who spent decades believing her marriage was completely unshakable. But reality had shifted, and I needed facts. The investigator's name was Robert Kane, a former police detective with nearly 30 years of experience. Michael Turner had recommended him. When we met, I felt embarrassed, ashamed, and as if hiring him somehow made my suspicions real. Robert listened patiently as I explained the situation, detailing Gregory's behavior, the strange expenses, the hotel charge, the phone secrecy, and the name, Vanessa. When I finished, he nodded thoughtfully. You'd be surprised how many times these stories start exactly this way, Mrs. Payne. The comment brought zero comfort. If anything, it made me feel worse. Before leaving, he asked a simple question. What are you hoping to find, Theresa? I stared at him. The answer should have been obvious, but it wasn't. Because part of me still desperately hoped I was entirely wrong. Part of me wanted Gregory to be innocent. I want the truth, I told him. Robert nodded. That's usually the hardest thing to accept. At the time, I didn't fully comprehend what he meant. A week later I did. The first report arrived on a Thursday afternoon. I remember the exact date clearly, because that was the day my remaining doubts began to vanish. Robert called to ask if we could meet, a request that immediately caused my stomach to twist. Good news rarely requires an in-person meeting. When I arrived at his office, a thin manila folder was sitting on the desk. Robert didn't speak right away. Instead, he slid the folder toward me. Inside were photographs. The first photo showed Gregory leaving his office building. The second showed him walking across a parking lot. The third showed him meeting a woman I had never seen before in my life. A woman with shoulder-length blonde hair, a confident smile, and professional attire. She looked to be in her early 40s, attractive, sophisticated, and successful. My eyes moved to the next photo, then the next, and the next. Having lunch together, walking side by side, laughing, holding hands. Holding hands. For a split second, I couldn't breathe. 38 years of marriage condensed into a handful of surveillance photos. I stared at the images until they blurred. Not because I couldn't see them, but because I desperately didn't want to. The woman had a name, Vanessa Cole. The name from Gregory's phone. The name from my nightmares. Now she had a face, a real smile, and a real presence in my husband's life. Robert remained completely silent while I processed the information. Finally, I forced myself to speak. How long? How?
He gave a cautious answer. We don't know exactly, Theresa.
The answer was reasonable, but it wasn't what I wanted. I wanted certainty, a specific date, a beginning, a moment where everything changed. Instead, all I had was proof that it was happening right now. As I continued reviewing the report, more details emerged. Vanessa worked in corporate insurance, lived about 40 minutes away from our house, and met with Gregory regularly. Not occasionally, but regularly. Lunches, dinners, weekends, hotel encounters. The pattern was impossible to deny. This wasn't a new relationship, or a casual mistake, or a momentary lapse in judgment. It was steady, intentional, and ongoing. The drive home felt endless. I cried harder than I had in years, not because Gregory had fallen for someone else. Strangely, that wasn't even the sharpest part of the pain. The worst part was realizing the sheer scale of the lies. Every dinner, every excuse, every meeting, every explanation, all of it had been perfectly constructed, all of it spoken while looking me dead in the eye. That level of deception changes something deep inside you. It forces you to question memories, conversations, past moments, and entire years of your life. When I walked through the door, Gregory was already there, watching television, completely relaxed and comfortable, as if nothing were wrong in the world. He smiled as I entered. "How was your day, honey?" The question nearly broke me, because for a fraction of a second I saw the man I used to love. Then I remembered the photos, the lies, the betrayal, and the illusion shattered. "Fine," I replied. The lie tasted bitter, but I wasn't ready to confront him yet. It wasn't the right time. Late that night, after Gregory fell asleep, I opened the investigator's report again. This time, I read every single page meticulously. Near the end, I uncovered information that shocked me far more than the affair itself. According to the observations in recorded conversations, Gregory wasn't just building a romantic relationship with Vanessa. He was making promises. Massive promises. Dangerous promises. Financial promises. One report included details from an overheard conversation at a restaurant. Gregory had been talking about retirement, a fresh start, a shared future, a future backed by substantial financial resources. The words turned my blood completely cold, because I recognized exactly what he was describing. He was describing our savings, our investments, our retirement funds, the life we spent decades building together. Gregory wasn't just leaving me emotionally. He was planning to use our shared future to fund an entirely separate life with someone else. Suddenly, Linda's warning made perfect sense. The questions at the bank, the unusual financial interest, the bizarre behavior, all the pieces fit together, and the picture was incredibly ugly. Over the next few days, more information arrived. More photos, more confirmation. The affair was undeniable. However, one detail stood out among all the rest. Vanessa seemed to believe him completely. She genuinely trusted Gregory. She believed he was preparing for a brand new life, that financial security was waiting for them, and that he was almost free. The realization produced an unexpected emotion, a strange sense of clarity. Not sympathy, not exactly, but close. Because Gregory wasn't just deceiving me, he was deceiving her too. Whatever promises he was making, he didn't actually control the assets he thought he did. He didn't own the future he was selling, and he certainly didn't understand how much I had already protected. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a quiet sense of control. Because while Gregory was busy spinning a fantasy with Vanessa, I was quietly solidifying my defences. He thought he was several steps ahead. In reality, he was walking straight into a situation he couldn't even see. Very soon, he would make his biggest mistake, the mistake that would expose his true intentions completely, the mistake that would lead him to empty our savings account. And when that day arrived, he would discover something he never expected. I was absolutely not the helpless wife he thought he was leaving behind. The day Gregory emptied our savings account started out exactly like any other Tuesday. There was absolutely nothing dramatic about that morning. No arguments, no warning signs, no indication that the next few hours would permanently alter the course of our lives. In fact, Gregory seemed unusually cheerful. He sipped his coffee, browsing the news on his tablet, and even made a casual joke about the weather forecast. For a fleeting second, looking across the kitchen table, I almost forgot about the photos, the affair, the lies, and his secret meetings with Vanessa. Almost. Then his phone buzzed on the counter. He glanced at the screen, and that familiar smile returned. The smile that didn't belong to me anymore. By 10 o'clock, Gregory had left for the office. I spent the morning organizing files in my workspace. Over the past few months, my life had become strange and fractured. Half of it was entirely normal, preparing meals, calling Ashley, running errands, and maintaining a peaceful surface. The other half existed entirely in the shadows. Lawyers, asset audits, evidence, protection, and preparation. I never imagined I'd become a woman who kept a manila folder full of evidence against her own husband. Yet, here I was. At 11:23, my phone vibrated in my hand. It was an automated notification from our bank. Normally, I would ignore routine alerts, but this one caught my eye instantly. The subject line indicated a massive transaction. My pulse began to race as I opened the alert. For a few seconds, I just stared at the screen. The balance displayed on the joint savings account looked completely wrong. Totally impossible. Then, the reality crashed over me. The shared savings account, the one Gregory thought contained our entire future, the one he monitored constantly, the account tied to decades of our hard work. It had been completely drained. Not reduced, not partially drawn down, but emptied. The amount transferred out was nearly every single dime left in the account. I remember sitting completely motionless. No panic, no tears, just a total stillness. Because the moment I saw that empty balance, I understood exactly what had happened. Gregory had finally made his move. After months of preparation, secrets, and deception, he had taken the leap. Remarkably, my first emotion wasn't anger. It was a profound disappointment. Even after discovering everything, a small part of me had still hoped he would stop, that he would snap out of it, remember the life we built together, and change his mind. Instead, he chose this. He chose her, he chose the money, and he chose betrayal. I closed my eyes and took a deep, centering breath, and then I did something Gregory never would have predicted. I smiled. Not because I was happy, but because I was completely prepared. The account he had drained wasn't the account holding my future. Months ago, after listening to Linda's warning and Michael's expert advice, I had already taken every necessary legal precaution to secure the assets that truly mattered. My mother's inheritance, those private investments, and the retirement funds under my control. The resources Gregory arrogantly assumed he could manipulate down the road were entirely safe, protected, and untouchable. He had taken the money,
But it wasn't the fortune he thought it was.
I dialed Michael's office immediately. He picked up on the second ring. Theresa, it happened. A brief silence hung on the line. Then his voice turned completely professional. The transfer went through? Yes. How much? I read off the exact figure. He let out a slow sigh, not out of surprise, but confirmation. The moment we had been preparing for had officially arrived. How do you want to handle this? I looked out the office window. For months I had been asking myself that very question. Now the answer was crystal clear. I don't want to wait any longer, Michael. Another pause followed, and then he said calmly, All right. We spent the next hour reviewing the strategy. Every detail, every account, every document, and every upcoming step. Because what Gregory failed to realize was that his choice carried heavy legal, financial, and personal consequences. And for the very first time, I was fully prepared to let him face them alone. Around 3 p.m, Gregory called. His voice carried an unmistakable note of excitement, which told me everything I needed to know. People usually assume that betrayal brings immediate guilt. In reality, some people experience something entirely different, a sense of pure relief. Gregory sounded relieved. as if a massive weight had been lifted, as if he had finally crossed his own finish line. "Hey," he said casually. "Hi. Is everything going okay over there?" The question was absurd, but completely predictable. He wanted to know if I had seen the transfer, if I had noticed, if I was panicking. I chose to give him absolutely nothing. "Everything is great, Gregory. Just fine. Is something wrong?" Silence. It was brief, but incredibly telling. Then he laughed nervously. "Nope. Just checking in. Just checking in." The phrase echoed in my mind after the call ended. He wasn't checking on me. He was checking on his plan. Checking to see if it worked. Checking to see if my reaction matched his expectations. Gregory's problem was simple. I wasn't playing the part he had written for me. That evening, he came home carrying takeout from my favorite restaurant. Under different circumstances, the gesture would have seemed thoughtful. Now it felt like an insult. We sat together at the dining room table, the exact same table where we had celebrated birthdays, anniversaries, graduations, and holidays, the table that held our entire history. Gregory appeared unusually relaxed and comfortable, almost triumphant. At one point, he even brought up the future.
Future plans? It was a deeply ironic joke, because while he was talking about tomorrow, he had already stolen from it. Finally, he looked directly at me. "Everything okay with the bank accounts lately?" There it was, the exact moment he could no longer contain his curiosity.
I met his gaze calmly. Why wouldn't it be? The expression on his face shifted instantly. It was subtle, but it was enough to reveal his uncertainty. For the first time all day, Gregory looked deeply uncomfortable. It wasn't guilt. It was total confusion. My reaction didn't fit the script he had imagined. He expected panic, confrontation, and tears. Instead, he got an unsettling calm. And an unshakable person is incredibly difficult to control. That night, after he went upstairs to bed, I stayed downstairs alone. The house felt entirely different now, not because of the missing money, but because of the finality of it all. For months, I had been living in the space between hope and reality. Tonight, reality won. The man upstairs hadn't just made a mistake or gone through a temporary phase. He had intentionally drained a joint account while secretly orchestrating a life with someone else. There were no more misunderstandings to clear up, no more explanations worth hearing, and absolutely no room left for trust. There were only the facts, and while facts can be incredibly painful, they also have the power to set you free. At midnight, I opened the folder Michael had prepared for me. It was filled with legal documents, financial disclosures, evidence, and timelines. Months of preparation compressed into a few inches of paper. As I reviewed the contents, an overwhelming calm washed over me. Not because I enjoyed what was about to happen, but because I finally knew exactly where I stood. For the first time in nearly a year, the uncertainty vanished completely. Gregory had made his choice. Now,
I was entirely free to make mine.
What I didn't know was that the financial transfer had set off a chain reaction that would move far faster than either of us anticipated. Because Gregory wasn't the only one making massive assumptions. Vanessa was making assumptions too. And very soon, both of them would discover the exact same truth. The wealth they thought Gregory had secured didn't exist. In reality, the future they had planned together was built entirely on an illusion. An illusion that was about to collapse completely.
If Gregory's betrayal broke my heart, what happened with Ashley nearly crushed my spirit. Looking back, I understand completely why she reacted the way she did. She loved her father, she trusted him, and like most children, even adult children, she desperately wanted to believe the absolute best of her parents. Unfortunately, Gregory understood that too, and he weaponized it.
3 days after the savings account was drained, Ashley called me completely out of the blue. I was sitting in my workspace, reviewing documents with Michael, when my phone rang. Seeing her name brought an automatic smile to my face, thinking she was just checking in. I answered instantly. "Hi, sweetie." "Hi." Her voice sounded incredibly strained. "Theresa, can we talk?" The fact that she used my first name instead of Mum immediately sent a chill through me. Ashley only did that when she was deeply upset. "Of course. What's wrong?" A heavy pause hung over the line. Then she asked a question I never anticipated. Why are you trying to destroy Dad?
The words hit me like a physical blow, leaving me speechless for several seconds. What are you talking about, Ashley?
You heard me? Her voice was trembling with emotion, confusion, and deep hurt. I closed my eyes. Gregory had already gotten to her. Of course he had. I should have seen it coming. When did you speak to your father? Yesterday. I nodded slowly to myself. That explained everything. Ashley continued. He told me you've been secretly moving money out of the accounts. I remained silent. He said you've been hiding marital assets. Still silence.
He said you've been planning to leave him for months.
The accusations kept coming, each one sharper than the last. Not because they were true, but because I knew exactly who had planted those ideas in her mind. Gregory, the man who spent months lying to both of us. The man who drained our savings. The man having an affair with another woman, had somehow managed to cast himself as the victim. I finally found my voice. Ashley, did your father happen to mention that he withdrew almost every single dollar from our joint savings account? Silence. A long, heavy silence. No, he didn't. The answer didn't surprise me at all. Of course he hadn't told her. Did he mention anything to you about Vanessa? Another long pause. Who is Vanessa? I felt a sharp pang in my chest. Not because Ashley didn't know, but because Gregory had carefully curated exactly what she was allowed to hear. He told her just enough to make me look like the villain while keeping his own secrets completely hidden. The realization made me physically sick. Ashley, there are things happening that you don't understand. Then explain it to me, Mom. I wanted to explain. God knows I wanted to tell her everything. The photographs, the affair, the lies, the investigation, the financial manipulation, every single ugly detail. But something stopped me. Maybe it was pride, or instinct, or simply realizing that if I dumped everything on her right now, she would view it as a malicious attack on her father. When people aren't emotionally ready to hear the truth, they rarely accept it, especially when it comes to the people they love. I can't explain everything right now, I said, knowing how weak it sounded. Ashley let out a heavy sigh. I figured. The disappointment in her voice hurt far worse than any of the accusations. And then she hung up. Just like that. I stared at the screen long after the call ended. Michael quietly closed the folder in front of him. Are you holding up okay, Theresa? I forced a tight smile. It was either that or break down completely. Losing the money my husband stole is one thing, I said, looking out the window. But losing my daughter, too. The sentence cracked before I could finish it. Michael remained completely silent. Sometimes silence is far kinder than advice. The week that followed was one of the loneliest periods of my life. Ashley stopped calling, stopped texting, and stopped replying to most of my messages. There was no dramatic argument or open hostility, just a freezing, distant wall. The exact same kind of distance Gregory had created between us months ago was now sitting between my daughter and me. One evening, I found myself flipping through old family photo albums. Ashley at 5 years old, Ashley learning to ride a bike, Ashley at her high school graduation, and standing next to us at her wedding. Every single image represented years of pure love, sacrifice, and shared memories. And now Gregory had weaponized that entire history against me.
The hardest part was knowing that Ashley genuinely believed she was doing the right thing. She wasn't trying to hurt me. She honestly thought she was protecting her father, safeguarding the family, and defending a version of a marriage she didn't fully understand. That made it much harder to blame her. Far harder.
A few days later, Ashley finally agreed to meet me for lunch. I arrived early, a nervous ball of hope and dread. When she walked into the restaurant, I noticed the change in her immediately. She looked completely exhausted. The stress was taking a heavy toll on her too. We ordered our food, exchanging superficial small talk about work and the weather, avoiding the elephant in the room entirely. Finally, Ashley set her fork down.
Why won't you just tell me what's actually going on, Mom?
I studied her face, truly looking at her. Not the adult woman sitting across from me, but the little girl I had raised. The child who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. The teenager who cried on my shoulder after her first heartbreak. The daughter who used to trust me completely. I want to tell you, Ashley. Then do it. I took a deep breath. If I say certain things right now, you're going to feel like I'm attacking your father. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Maybe that's because you are. The remark was incredibly sharp, but I refused to react. Instead, I reached into my purse. I didn't pull out the surveillance photos or the investigation reports. I just pulled out a single piece of paper, the official bank statement showing Gregory's massive withdrawal. I slid it gently across the table. Ashley looked down at it, her expression shifting slightly as she scanned the document. "What is this?" "This is the money your father told you I was hiding from him." She continued to read the statement slowly and carefully. For the very first time since this nightmare began, a look of profound uncertainty crossed her face. It was just a small shift, but it was enough to introduce doubt. "He withdrew all of this?" "Yes." "When?" "Last week." Ashley looked completely stunned. For the first time, a concrete fact directly contradicted Gregory's narrative. It wasn't the whole truth yet, but it was enough to spark suspicion. I could see the internal conflict behind her eyes. Her love for her father, struggling against the cold reality of the financial record. It wasn't enough to completely change her mind instantly, but it was enough to make her start questioning the story she'd been told. And sometimes, questioning is the very beginning of finding the truth. When lunch ended, Ashley reached out and hugged me. The embrace felt different than before. Less certain, more complicated. But it was still a hug. In that moment, I felt immensely grateful for that tiny victory. Watching her walk away from the restaurant, I realized a vital truth. I could force a confrontation with Gregory right now, expose every single piece of evidence, and throw the photos on the table. But doing so would permanently damage my relationship with Ashley. Despite everything Gregory had done, I still wanted to protect our daughter from the shrapnel of our collapsing marriage. So I made a conscious choice. I would wait. I would let the truth unfold naturally. Because lies eventually become far too heavy to carry. Contradictions become impossible to conceal, and reality always catches up. When that day arrived, Ashley would see clearly exactly who had been telling the truth all along. What I didn't know was that the day of reckoning was approaching far faster than anyone anticipated. Gregory's confidence was expanding rapidly, and overconfident people always make careless, catastrophic mistakes. If there's one universal truth I've learned about dishonest people, it's that they constantly mistake silence for weakness. Gregory was certainly no exception to that rule. After draining the savings account, he braced himself for chaos. He expected a massive confrontation and an emotional panic from me. Instead, I gave him total calm, and that calm allowed him to become dangerously overconfident. Over the next few weeks, Gregory carried himself like a man who believed the game was already won. He spent significantly more time away from the house, completely stopping any effort to make excuses for his long absences. Sometimes he wouldn't return until long past midnight, and some nights he simply didn't come home at all. When I asked where he had been, he barely bothered to construct a plausible explanation. The secrecy vanished, replaced by pure arrogance. He genuinely believed I was entirely powerless. Unfortunately for Gregory, arrogance breeds carelessness, and careless people leave paper trails, massive paper trails. Around that time, Michael formally initiated the financial discovery process, connected to our separation. Although the final divorce paperwork wasn't settled, the legal machinery was moving forward. For the first time, Gregory was legally required to produce documentation. Real records, not stories, not excuses, and not carefully spun lies, but facts. I remember the exact day Michael called with the first major breakthrough. His voice sounded unusually grave over the line. "Theresa, I think we found something significant." My stomach tightened instantly. "What is it?" "A series of transactions." I grabbed my notebook immediately. "What kind of transactions?" Michael paused for a moment. The kind Gregory likely assumed no one would ever notice. An hour later, I sat across from him in his office, reviewing the forensic records. The documents exposed a distinct pattern. It wasn't just one suspicious transaction or two, but dozens of them. Over the past few months, substantial funds had been moving in ways that made zero financial sense. Small transfers, frequent withdrawals, and unusual payments. Individually, they looked insignificant. Together, they painted an incredibly troubling picture. "What exactly am I looking at here?" I asked. Michael pointed directly to a section of the financial audit. potential dissipation of marital assets. The legal terms landed heavily in the quiet room. I stared at the page. Gregory hadn't just been lying about his whereabouts. He appeared to be actively concealing financial maneuvers. The realization was deeply unsettling. Not because of the monetary value, but because it exposed systematic planning, intent, and long-term strategy. This wasn't a sudden lapse in judgment. It was a calculated strategy.
The deeper we reviewed the records, the worse it became. Several transactions linked directly to accounts I had never seen before in my life. Others clearly funded expenses involving Vanessa, hotel bookings, luxury travel, and high-end purchases. Expenses Gregory never would have approved if we were building our future together. Yet somehow he had authorized them for himself without a single qualm. The hypocrisy was absolutely staggering.
Then Michael showed me a document that turned my blood completely cold. It was a financial authorization form bearing my signature, but I had never seen it before in my life. I had never signed it, never authorized it, and never even knew it existed. At first glance, the signature looked remarkably like mine, close enough to fool most eyes. But I knew instantly it was a fake. I had signed financial documents for decades. I knew the rhythm of my own handwriting. This wasn't it. I looked up at Michael. What is this? His expression darkened completely. That's exactly what I intend to find out legally. For several seconds, neither of us said a word, because we both understood the terrifying implications of what lay on the desk. Someone had attempted to forge my signature on an asset transfer document, and only one person stood to benefit from that forgery. Gregory. A wave of physical nausea washed over me. It wasn't a legal concern. It was a profound grief over his character. An affair was one thing. Financial dishonesty was another. But forging a legal document crossed into entirely different territory. A boundary I never believed Gregory would cross. Yet there it was, printed in black and white. Permanent, real, and undeniable. Driving home that evening, a flood of memories rushed through my mind. Birthday parties, family vacations, Christmas mornings, all the decades we had shared, all the trust I had given him, all the faith I had placed in his word. How had we arrived at this point? When exactly did Gregory transform into this version of himself? Or had this stranger been hiding beneath the surface the entire time? The question echoed relentlessly in my mind. When Gregory arrived home that night, he was in an exceptionally good mood. He seemed energized, almost buoyant, as if something exciting had just happened. For the first time in months, I understood exactly why. He believed he was pulling it off perfectly. He believed his strategy was flawless and that I remained completely oblivious. The sheer irony of it was painful. Over dinner, he casually brought up future financial discussions, masking his intent with a dismissive shrug. Lawyers always find a way to complicate simple things. I looked up calmly. What things? He waved a hand carelessly. You know, splitting assets, settlement agreements, all that background noise. Background noise? The phrase almost made me laugh out loud. 38 years of marriage reduced to background noise. I forced myself to maintain complete composure. Are you worried about it? He smiled with absolute confidence. Not even a little bit. The answer came too fast, too smooth, and with far too much certainty. Because Gregory was operating under the assumption that the numbers were entirely in his favor. He assumed that draining the joint savings account meant absolute victory. He assumed his hidden transactions would remain buried forever. He assumed I was still operating on pure emotion, rather than executing a careful strategic defense. Every single one of his assumptions was completely wrong. A few days later, a development surfaced that caught even Michael by surprise. Extra financial records arrived through our formal legal requests. The updated documents exposed even deeper inconsistencies, mismatched dates, incomplete financial disclosures, and entirely unreported assets. The pattern had become impossible for the legal system to ignore. Gregory wasn't just disorganized, he was systematically choosing what information to provide, and courts rarely tolerate selective honesty. Michael certainly wasn't going to. During a review session, he leaned back in his chair and shook his head. He's making this significantly worse for himself than it ever needed to be. I nodded slowly. because I understood something Michael didn't. Gregory spent months convincing himself that he was the smartest person in any room. Smarter than me, smarter than Vanessa, smarter than the legal system, and smarter than reality itself. People who believe that always end up making catastrophic errors. The problem is, they usually don't recognize the mistake until it's far too late to fix it. Meanwhile, Ashley remained caught firmly in the middle of our collapsing world. Our relationship was improving slightly, but only in tiny increments. The seed of doubt planted by that bank statement was beginning to grow inside her. I could see it in her posture, hear it in her voice, and feel it in her hesitation. She desperately still wanted to trust her father, but the facts were becoming increasingly difficult for her to ignore. One afternoon, my phone rang unexpectedly, and her voice came through the speaker. "Mom!" Just hearing that single word brought a rush of emotion that nearly moved me to tears. "Hi, sweetie."
She hesitated for a moment, then asked a question that changed everything. "Mom, has Dad always handled money this way?"
That single question told me everything I needed to know. The pieces were no longer fitting together, and even she was starting to see the cracks. I answered her with absolute honesty. "No, Ashley, he haven't." Silence stretched over the line before she whispered her next question. "Do you think he's telling me the whole truth?" I had been waiting for this exact moment for months. The moment Ashley finally started questioning the narrative she had been fed. Still, I chose my words with immense caution. "I think your father is telling you the version of the story that makes him look the best." The silence that followed felt entirely different. It wasn't defensive anymore. It was reflective, heavy with internal conflict. And that is exactly where the truth usually begins. After we hung up, I sat quietly in the stillness of the office for a few minutes. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, a spark of hope flared in my chest. Not because things were suddenly getting better, but because reality was finally breaking through his defenses. Reality always wins in the end. It might take time, and it almost always brings pain. But the truth has a remarkable way of surviving. As for Gregory, his overconfidence only continued to swell. He genuinely believed the future belonged entirely to him. He believed Vanessa was waiting for him, and that the money he stole represented his ultimate freedom. What he failed to comprehend was that the very foundation supporting his entire plan was already fractured. Soon, that foundation would crumble completely. Because there was another person Gregory had lied to just as much as me. Vanessa. And she was about to start asking her own questions. The kind of questions Gregory had absolutely no way of answering. The dinner party that shifted the entire balance of power wasn't my idea. It was Ashley's. Looking back, I think she was desperately trying to salvage whatever fragments of our family were left. Maybe she wanted to save our home, or her relationship with her father, or maybe a part of her still needed to believe that the people she loved weren't capable of causing each other such profound agony. Whatever the reason, she called me one Sunday afternoon. "I want us all to have dinner together." I knew exactly what she meant. Not just a casual lunch between a mother and daughter, but everyone. Bringing the entire chaotic mess to a single table. "Are you sure about this, Ashley?" I asked.
"No," she admitted, her voice cracking slightly. "I'm really not."
Hearing that honesty broke my heart because Ashley sounded completely drained. Months ago, she had been so confident, so certain, entirely convinced that her father was the injured party. Now, that certainty had been replaced by a growing mountain of doubt. We agreed to meet the following Friday evening at a restaurant located halfway between our homes. A neutral location. Public, open, and safe. The moment I arrived, I knew something was deeply wrong. Ashley was already seated, and Gregory was there too, but sitting right next to him was Vanessa. For a split second, I just froze at the entrance. Not because I was shocked. I had known about Vanessa's existence for months, but because of his pure, unadulterated audacity. It was an act of complete contempt. Gregory hadn't just brought his mistress. He had brought her to a dinner arranged by our daughter, a dinner intended to heal a fractured family. Ashley looked absolutely mortified. It was glaringly obvious she had no idea Vanessa would be there. The expression on her face told the entire story. This was a choice Gregory had made entirely on his own. I considered turning around and walking out. To be completely honest, I probably should have. Most people would have left right then. Instead, I took a deep breath and walked straight toward the table. If Gregory wanted a performance, I wasn't going to give him the reaction he was looking for.
The moment I sat down, a suffocating, uncomfortable silence fell over the table. Vanessa forced a polite smile, and I returned it. Not because I liked her, but because she wasn't the person who had broken a lifelong vow to me. Gregory was. People often ask if I hated Vanessa, but the truth is far more complicated. She didn't owe me anything. Gregory was the one who owed me everything.
Ashley finally shattered the silence, her voice tight. Dad, why is Vanessa here? Gregory leaned back in his chair, radiating an arrogant confidence. As an important part of my life, she deserves absolute honesty too. The statement was staggering, not because of the words themselves, but because of how carelessly he threw them out, as if 38 years of marriage could simply be swept aside to start a new chapter. He acted as if people were just pieces of furniture you could swap out when you grew tired of them, as if loyalty meant nothing. Ashley stared at him, her eyes wide. Dad, this was supposed to be a family dinner. It is, he replied smoothly. The answer felt like a physical slap across the face. I studied Ashley's expression closely. For the very first time, I saw genuine, deep-seated disappointment in her eyes. It wasn't confusion or uncertainty anymore. It was the look of a daughter realizing who her father truly was. The dinner went downhill rapidly from there. The conversation was incredibly tense, strained, and painfully awkward. Vanessa remained quiet for the most part, but Gregory seemed completely unbothered, almost boastful, as if he believed he had already won. Finally, he turned his focus directly to me. You know, Theresa, all of this could have been handled very differently. I almost laughed out loud. Differently? The man who had systematically drained our savings account, the man having an affair, the man hiding assets, the man who spent months constructing an elaborate web of lies. Now he was criticizing my actions. I crossed my arms calmly. Like how, Gregory? You could have been more honest from the start.
Ashley blinked in surprise, and even Vanessa looked thoroughly confused. I just stared at him, watching the sheer hypocrisy hang in the air. It was completely suffocating. What exactly have I been dishonest about?
For the first time all evening, Gregory hesitated. It was only for a fraction of a second, but it was long enough for everyone at the table to notice. He quickly recovered his composure. The money. Ashley's eyes locked onto me instantly. I thought to myself, here it comes. This was the exact story Gregory had been rehearsing for months. The narrative that Theresa was secretly moving assets behind his back. Ashley frowned, and Vanessa's brow furrowed slightly as well. I chose to stay completely silent, letting him dig his own grave. Gregory pressed on, his voice growing more aggressive. She started planning her exit months ago. Planning? It was an interesting choice of words, because technically he was right. I had planned. I had planned exactly how to protect myself from a man who was secretly engineering a massive betrayal. But he conveniently left that part out of his speech. Ashley looked increasingly uncomfortable. Dad, stop. But Gregory kept pushing, his arrogance blinding him. I always believed marriage was built on absolute trust. For several long seconds, nobody said a word. Then, out of nowhere, Ashley looked directly at him. What about the savings account, Dad? The question hung heavily in the air. Gregory froze completely. It wasn't a dramatic gasp or an obvious panic, but it was enough. Enough for me to notice, enough for Ashley to see, and enough for Vanessa to register. What about it? Gregory asked, his voice tightening. Ashley leaned forward over her plate. Why didn't you tell me you emptied it? A beautiful, revealing silence blanketed the table. Gregory had never anticipated that question. He fully expected Ashley to blindly defend him, but instead she was cross-examining him. I saw a flash of pure panic cross his face for a single second before he shrugged it off. I was just protecting myself. That single admission completely altered the entire atmosphere in the room because it exposed his double standard with total clarity. When Gregory moved money, it was called protection. When I secured my assets, it was labelled a betrayal. Ashley called it instantly, I could see it in her eyes. And Vanessa noticed it too. Her expression shifted, becoming much more contemplative and guarded, as if she was suddenly hearing a piece of the story that didn't match the script she had been given. The remainder of the dinner became increasingly unbearable for Gregory. Questions started surfacing. Small, logical questions that he simply couldn't answer without contradicting himself. Why hadn't he mentioned specific withdrawals? Why had he kept Vanessa completely hidden from Ashley? Why didn't the timelines match up? Why did his explanations keep shifting? For months, Gregory had successfully controlled the narrative by keeping everyone in separate silos. Now he faced a fatal problem. Everyone was sitting at the exact same table, comparing notes, and a lie rarely survives a direct comparison with the facts. Finally, Vanessa asked a question that caught me completely by surprise. What exactly is the story with the savings account, Gregory? Gregory answered far too quickly. Theresa's just exaggerating the numbers as usual. I noticed something vital in that moment. Vanessa didn't look like she believed him at all, and neither did Ashley. For the very first time, Gregory was losing complete control of the room. It wasn't a sudden collapse, but it was enough to force him onto the defensive, enough to spark a deep frustration, and enough to tear wide open the cracks in his perfectly polished image. As the dinner drew to a close, I reached into my purse. The simple movement caught Gregory's attention immediately, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. I didn't pull out any dramatic surveillance photos or private investigator reports. I just pulled out a single photocopy of the official bank withdrawal statement and laid it gently on the table. That was all it took. Ashley looked down at it, and then Vanessa leaned over to scan the page. Neither woman said a word. They just stared at the cold, hard data. And as they looked, the entire dynamic shifted. Because numbers are incredibly difficult to argue with. Dates don't lie, and facts don't care about a rehearsed excuse, especially when they are printed in black and white. Slowly but surely, the arrogant confidence began to drain from Gregory's face. For months, he had been bracing himself for an emotional panic from me. Instead, I just kept presenting unshakable facts, and those facts were turning into a massive problem for him. When dinner finally ended, no one left feeling relieved. Nobody was satisfied, and nothing had been neatly resolved. But the evening had achieved one monumental thing. It planted a deep, immovable seed of doubt in everyone's mind. It was there in Ashley, it was there in Vanessa, and it was certainly there in Gregory. Because I think he finally realized his carefully constructed web of lies was beginning to unravel. And once people start questioning one lie, they inevitably begin to question them all. As I was driving home that night, my phone buzzed on the console. It was a short text message from Ashley, containing just 4 words. I don't know anymore. Most people would see that uncertainty as a setback, but I saw it as pure progress. Because total certainty was what protected Gregory. Doubt would destroy him. What none of us knew then was that Vanessa was driving home with her own questions too. Questions about the money, the promises, and the grand future Gregory had endlessly sketched out for her. Very soon, she would start demanding answers he simply couldn't give. 3 days after that disastrous dinner, my phone rang at 9:30 in the morning. I almost didn't answer because it was an unrecognized number, and usually I let unknown callers go straight to voicemail. But an instinct urged me to pick up. Hello? For a moment, there was only silence on the other end. Then a woman took a sharp, steadying breath. Theresa! I recognized the voice instantly. It was Vanessa. I sat up straight in my chair, completely stunned. Of all the phone calls I expected to receive that week, this was absolutely not on the list. Yes, Vanessa. Another heavy pause followed. I think we need to talk. The sheer irony of the situation was almost overwhelming. Months ago, I viewed Vanessa as my ultimate enemy, the woman destroying my marriage and stealing my husband. Now she didn't sound like a villain at all. She sounded completely confused, incredibly tense, and deeply frightened.
We agreed to meet that afternoon at a quiet little cafe on the other side of town, neutral ground. When I arrived, she was already seated at a corner table. The very first thing I noticed was that she looked absolutely nothing like the confident, polished woman from the surveillance photographs. The self-assured smile was entirely gone, replaced by a deep, hollow exhaustion. She looked like someone who hadn't slept in days, someone whose entire world was starting to fracture.
For a few seconds, neither of us said a word. Then, Vanessa finally shattered the silence. Gregory has been lying to me. I didn't react. Not because I was surprised, but because I wanted to give her the space to keep talking. She offered a bitter laugh. You already knew that, didn't you? It was a completely fair point, so I remained quiet, letting her proceed. Vanessa looked down into her coffee cup before speaking again. He told me he was trapped in a completely miserable marriage. Of course he did. He told me you controlled every single dime and locked him out. Of course he did. He told me you were secretly hiding marital assets behind his back. Of course he did. Every single sentence sounded painfully familiar. Not because I had heard them directly, but because Gregory had been feeding different versions of the exact same script to everyone in his life. Ashley, Vanessa, and probably even himself. The exact same narrative, the same excuses, and the same elaborate fabrications. Vanessa rubbed her temples. In the beginning, I genuinely believed every word.
I nodded slowly. I know.
She looked up, surprised. How could you possibly know that? Because most people want to believe the person they care about. The remark seemed to land heavily on her. For a moment, the quiet returned. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a thick stack of printed pages, sliding them across the table. I recognized what they were instantly. Text messages. Hundreds of them. My pulse quickened. Vanessa pushed the papers closer to me. I think you need to read these. I looked at her calmly. Why? The answer came out without hesitation. Because they contain the truth. Over the next hour, we reviewed message after message, conversation after conversation, in promise after promise. The deeper I read, the uglier the picture became. Gregory had promised Vanessa an absolute fantasy of a future. A luxury home, extensive travel, total financial freedom, early retirement, and a completely fresh start. He spoke with an arrogance that suggested an immense fortune was already waiting for them.
As if their freedom was guaranteed and every obstacle had already been effortlessly cleared.
But then I uncovered something even more significant. Messages explicitly discussing money. Specific amounts. Our money.
One message, in particular, turned my blood to ice. Gregory had written, "Once I finalize the transfer of the funds, Theresa won't even know what hit her, and will never have to worry about money again."
I read that sentence 3 times, then 4, then 5 times. Because there it was. The concrete, undeniable proof. It wasn't just marital infidelity anymore. It was clear, documented intent to commit financial fraud. Vanessa watched my reaction closely. I had absolutely no idea what he actually meant by that at the time. I looked up from the pages. When did you first start doubting him, Vanessa? Her expression darkened. The dinner party. I wasn't surprised. That dinner had shifted everything. Not because I had actively unmasked Gregory, but because his own arrogance had caused him to expose his true nature. Vanessa continued. The way he reacted when Ashley asked about the savings account, it just didn't add up. No, of course it didn't. She had caught the inconsistency. Following that dinner, Vanessa began asking her own questions. Simple, logical questions that any honest partner should have been able to answer effortlessly. Where was the money kept? What specific assets did he actually control? What exactly was happening with the legal separation? Instead of answers, she received nothing but excuses, deflections, sudden anger, and glaring contradictions. The story kept shifting, and every new version only generated more suspicion. Finally, she demanded to see the official documentation, the physical financial records. Gregory flatly refused.
That refusal triggered the final collapse, because once trust vanishes, people start actively looking for the facts. Vanessa eventually uncovered a paper trail of her own, not through elaborate spying, but through simple, observant eyes. She noticed bills, bank statements, and legal correspondence, the pieces of information Gregory never intended for her to see. It was enough to make her realize an undeniable truth. The wealthy future he had endlessly described didn't exist. At least,
not the way he claimed. She looked directly at me. He made it sound like he was in complete control of everything. I let out a soft laugh. Not because it was funny, but because it was completely absurd. Gregory didn't even know what he could actually control anymore. Vanessa let out a heavy sigh. I think he genuinely believed his own lies. The observation surprised me, but the more I thought about it, the truer it felt. Gregory had spent so long constructing fabrications that he had actually started believing his own distorted version of reality. It's a dangerous habit, especially when dealing with the legal system. Finally, Vanessa slid a small USB drive across the table. I stared down at it. What's this? A complete backup. My eyes widened. Of what? She nodded toward the papers. Text messages, emails, and financial voicemails he left me. For several seconds, I was completely speechless. The value of that drive extended far beyond emotional validation. This was concrete legal evidence, a documented timeline, recorded statements, and clear financial intent. The exact material lawyers live for and the material judges cannot ignore. Vanessa looked down, appearing thoroughly embarrassed. I know you probably hate me, Theresa. I considered her words carefully. Months ago, absolutely. But sitting across from her now? I realized I didn't hate her at all. The woman sitting in front of me wasn't a malicious mastermind. She wasn't a villain. She was just another person Gregory had systematically manipulated, another person who had fallen for his empty promises, and another person discovering the agonizing truth. I don't hate you, Vanessa. Tears immediately spilled over her lashes, a raw reaction that caught me slightly off guard. Then she let out a nervous, watery laugh. Well, I'm starting to hate him. That brought the very first genuine smile to my face all afternoon. Not because the situation was humorous, but because absolute honesty had finally entered the room. When we finished talking, Vanessa stood up to leave. Then she paused at the table, her expression turning incredibly serious. There's one more thing you should know. The gravity in her voice caught my attention. What is it? She locked eyes with me. He's becoming deeply desperate, Theresa. A chill ran down my spine. What do you mean, desperate? He keeps talking about winning at all costs. Winning? The word sounded entirely ridiculous. A marriage isn't a game, and a family isn't a competition. Yet that was exactly how Gregory viewed our entire life. Vanessa continued. He keeps saying that once the formal legal proceedings are over, everything will be settled in his favor. I nodded slowly, because I understood the one vital piece of reality Gregory completely failed to grasp. The legal proceedings were not moving in his favor at all. Far from it. And very soon, he was going to find out the hard way. After Vanessa left, I sat at the table alone for a few more minutes, staring down at the USB drive and the stack of messages. Months ago, Gregory believed he could flawlessly control everyone's narrative. Mine, Ashley's, and Vanessa's. Now those narratives were colliding head-on, exposing him completely. For the very first time since this entire nightmare began, I felt the scales tilt decisively. Not emotionally, but factually. The truth was finally catching up, and once the truth starts moving, it moves incredibly fast. I delivered the materials to Michael that very evening. He spent nearly an hour meticulously reviewing every single document and file. When he finally looked up, the expression on his face told the entire story. This changes the game completely, Theresa. I nodded. I already knew. Gregory had made the fatal mistake of assuming the women in his life would never talk to each other, never compare notes, and never see through his illusions. Now they had, and reality was taking over. What none of us realized then was that the most significant battle was still ahead of us. The courtroom. That was the place where Gregory would finally be forced to answer for his actions, with no excuses, no manipulation, and no control. Only the cold, hard facts. And those facts were becoming incredibly dangerous for him. The morning of the final court hearing, the sky was a heavy dark grey, casting a relentless cold drizzle over the city. Some people believe the weather reflects human emotion, and standing outside the courthouse, watching the raindrops slide down the massive windows, the world felt incredibly heavy, matching the exact weight I carried inside. 38 years. The number kept repeating like a broken record in my mind. 38 years of marriage, 38 years of trust, all reducing down to a single courtroom appearance. I never imagined my life would lead to this place. Yet there I stood next to Michael Turner, holding a folder packed with evidence against the man I once believed I would grow old with. "Are you ready, Theresa?" Michael asked gently.
No, of course not. Nobody is ever truly ready for something like this. Still, I nodded firmly. Preparation didn't matter anymore. Only courage did.
Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere felt unnervingly quiet, sterile, and entirely detached. The room didn't care about heartbreak or decades of shared history. It cared strictly about facts, procedures, and documented evidence. And today, the facts were completely on my side. Gregory sat on the opposite side of the aisle. For the first time in months, his arrogant confidence seemed completely gone. The change was immediately noticeable. The boastful posture I had seen in previous weeks had shrunk, as if the reality of the legal system was finally crushing his carefully constructed fantasy. He completely avoided making direct eye contact with me, keeping his focus pinned to the documents on his table. The gesture felt deeply ironic. For months, Gregory had ruthlessly controlled every conversation and narrative. Now he faced a process far larger than himself, and he knew it. The hearing began promptly as Judge Eleanor Grant entered the courtroom, immediately commanding the room. She was experienced, completely composed, and possessed a razor-sharp gaze. The kind of judge who can spot an inconsistency before a lie even finishes leaving a witness's mouth. The realization brought a small wave of comfort. If anyone could cut through Gregory's performance, it would be her. The proceedings kicked off with the formal financial disclosures, records, account histories, and asset audits. The terminology was highly technical, almost clinical at times. But buried deep inside those stacks of paper lay an undeniable truth.
Michael meticulously laid out our timeline. The joint accounts, the savings, the sudden massive withdrawal, the unreported transactions, the asset transfers, and the hidden corporate expenses. Every single document added another vital piece to the puzzle. Initially, Gregory attempted to maintain a calm facade, occasionally whispering to his attorney or checking his notes. But as the mountain of evidence continued to pile up, his posture visibly deflated.
The first major blow landed when the discussion shifted to the unauthorized draining of our joint savings account. Michael presented the transaction records, the exact dates, the figures, and the authorization details. The data spoke entirely for itself. Judge Grant reviewed the documents in absolute silence before turning her sharp gaze directly to Gregory. "Did you authorize this specific withdrawal?" Gregory cleared his throat, his voice tighter than usual. "Yes, Your Honor."
The answer didn't surprise anyone. It was the next question that carried all the weight. Did you notify your spouse prior to executing this transaction?
A long, suffocating silence filled the room. Finally, Gregory answered in a quiet voice. "No."
Judge Grant made a careful note on her pad, the sound of her pen scratching against the paper, cutting through the quiet. Everyone in the room understood the gravity of that moment. It wasn't a dramatic explosion, but it was incredibly revealing. That withdrawal wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate, calculated choice. And deliberate choices carry consequences.
The hearing pressed forward, introducing more financial summaries and extensive transaction histories. Then Michael presented the concrete evidence regarding the previously hidden financial activities. The entire energy in the room shifted instantly. Even Gregory's attorney looked visibly uncomfortable as document after document exposed glaring inconsistencies, incomplete disclosures, and suspicious financial explanations. Absolutely nothing he had submitted held up under scrutiny. Then came the issue of the forged signature. The entire room seemed to hold its breath as Michael produced the authorization form, the document bearing my alleged signature that I had never seen before in my life. Judge Grant studied the document meticulously, comparing it directly against my verified signature samples. For a long moment, nobody said a word. Finally, she looked up and addressed Gregory directly. "Can you explain this discrepancy, Mr. Payne?" I watched his face closely. For the very first time all day, a look of pure, unadulterated panic flashed across his features. It was brief, but it was entirely unmistakable. His attorney quickly intervened, offering a flurry of alternative explanations. Miscommunication, administrative oversight, a potential misunderstanding. But the problem was simple. None of the excuses fit the physical evidence, and everyone in that room knew it. As the proceedings continued, Linda Brooks took the stand. The bank officer who had delivered that vital warning months ago remained completely professional, cautious, and precise. She never breached confidentiality guidelines, never exaggerated, and never speculated. She simply stated exactly what she had observed. Gregory's specific questions, his probing financial inquiries, his unusual interest in asset movements, and his distinct pattern of behaviour. The testimony was utterly devastating, precisely because it was so calm. There was no drama or emotion, just a steady presentation of facts. And facts are incredibly difficult to dismantle. Throughout most of her testimony, Gregory kept his eyes fixed firmly on the table. And then it was Vanessa's turn. It was a moment absolutely no one could have predicted. Least of all, Gregory, a year ago. Watching her walk into that courtroom felt completely surreal. Months ago, she had been his closely guarded secret. Now she was a witness for the defense of our marital estate. Life possesses a remarkable sense of irony. Vanessa testified with absolute honesty, carrying no malice or desire for revenge. She simply stated the facts, describing the explicit promises Gregory had made to her, the financial assurances, the future timelines, the statements regarding shared resources and marital assets. She confirmed a vital detail. Gregory had repeatedly described those financial resources as if they were entirely his to manipulate. The courtroom fell completely still. Her testimony directly contradicted almost every single explanation he had previously offered his attorneys. A single contradiction can be brushed aside as an oversight. 10 contradictions form an undeniable pattern. By the time Vanessa finished speaking, I noticed something unexpected. Gregory didn't look angry anymore. He looked completely defeated. Perhaps for the very first time, he finally comprehended the reality of his situation. All of his separate narratives had collided, and the crash left him totally exposed. The hearing continued for several hours, as forensic experts reviewed the audits and final arguments were delivered. By late afternoon, an overwhelming exhaustion settled over everyone. Yet one thing remained indisputable. The evidence against him was monumental. Not because of a single, explosive revelation, but because of its absolute consistency. Every document supported the next, every witness reinforced the pattern, and every fact pointed in the exact same direction. When the truth emerges from every single angle, it becomes completely impossible to outrun. Near the end of the proceedings, Gregory was given a direct opportunity to address the court regarding specific discrepancies. I listened intently, a small part of me wondering if he would finally offer the truth, if he would finally accept accountability, if the man I had loved for nearly 40 years still existed somewhere beneath the layers of deception. Instead, Gregory blamed circumstances, immense stress, miscommunication, and confusion. Everything and everyone except himself. The disappointment was profound, not because I expected an 11th hour redemption, but because I realized he still didn't understand. Even now, after everything had been laid bare in a court of law, he still viewed himself as the victim. Judge Grant listened patiently until he finished, then quietly closed her folder. The courtroom fell into absolute silence. When she spoke, her words were measured, professional, and entirely unmistakable. She expressed profound concern over Gregory's financial conduct, his selective disclosures, and his complete lack of credibility. The word credibility echoed in my mind, because that was the true loss. Not the money or the physical property, but his credibility, his trustworthiness, and his character. The very things Gregory spent years destroying. While the final legal decrees would require additional processing steps, the direction of the case was completely settled. The momentum had shifted decisively. As people began leaving the courtroom, I stayed in my seat for a moment longer, taking a deep breath and letting the finality sink in. Michael placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "You did beautifully, Theresa." I nodded slowly, but victory wasn't the word that matched my emotions. It was pure, unadulterated relief. The truth had finally taken over the room, publicly, officially, and permanently. Stepping outside the courthouse, the drizzle had stopped. The heavy clouds were beginning to part, letting small streams of sunlight cut through the grey. For the first time in a very long time, the weight in my chest felt lighter. I wasn't completely healed, not yet, but the suffocating burden of proving reality was finally gone. Reality had proven itself. What I didn't know then was that the most profound emotional moment was still waiting for me. It wouldn't happen in a courtroom, or with lawyers, or before a judge. It would happen with Ashley, because she was about to discover a detail that would shatter the last remaining illusion she held about her father. And once she saw it, everything would change. Forever. The phone call came 2 days after the court hearing. It was early morning, and I was sitting on the back porch watching the sunlight stretch across the neighborhood. For the first time in months, I felt something closely resembling actual peace. Not happiness, but the absence of constant, low-grade dread. The legal system had finally validated the truth, and the endless uncertainty was over. Or so I thought. Then my phone buzzed on the table. Ashley. Seeing her name caused an automatic tightening in my chest. Our relationship had been improving since the dinner party, and the walls between us were starting to crumble. But they weren't entirely gone. Too much damage had been done, and too many lies had stood between us for too long. I answered immediately. "Hi, sweetie." Total silence greeted me. For a split second, I thought the call had dropped. Then I heard a sound that completely broke my heart. Sob. Not a quiet tear or a soft sniffle, but a deep, agonizing sob from the chest. The kind of cry that happens when something you desperately hoped wasn't true turns out to be undeniable reality. "Ashley?" She tried to speak, but failed. She tried again, her voice completely shattered. "Mom." I stood up instantly. "What's wrong? What happened?" More sobbing echoed through the line. Finally, she managed to choke out 3 words. I saw them.
Those 3 words hit me harder than anything that had transpired in the courtroom, because I understood instantly. Somehow Ashley had uncovered the truth, the full, unvarnished truth.
"Where are you?" I asked. She managed to name a small park nearby. 20 minutes later, I found her sitting entirely alone on a secluded bench. The moment she caught sight of me, she sprang up and ran toward me. She didn't just walk. She ran like a terrified child seeking a safe harbor, like the little girl who used to race to my arms after scraping her knee. The moment she reached me, she threw her arms around my neck and broke down into heavy sobs again. I held her tightly, anchoring her in the quiet park. Neither of us said a word. Sometimes language is completely unnecessary. Sometimes pain speaks entirely for itself. After a few minutes, Ashley finally pulled back, her eyes swollen and her face incredibly pale. She looked entirely spent. "What happened, Ashley?" I asked softly.
She sat back down on the wooden bench, her hands trembling as she handed me her phone. I looked down at the screen and understood everything in a flash. Text messages. But it wasn't a conversation between Gregory and Vanessa. It was a chat history between Gregory and one of his lifelong friends. Ashley had clearly stumbled across the thread accidentally.
I scrolled down slowly, every line causing my stomach to turn. Not because I was surprised by Gregory's dishonesty, but because the messages exposed his unvarnished thoughts, the version of himself he kept hidden when no one was watching.
One message stood out instantly. Gregory had written, "Once I get the finances completely secured, Theresa won't even understand how she got blindsided."
I scrolled further. She's entirely too trusting. Another read, I should have executed this move years ago. And then I hit the message that had completely shattered Ashley, the line she couldn't stop reading, the line that altered her entire world forever. Gregory had written, "Ashley will eventually accept the situation. She operates purely on emotion, but she's incredibly useful to have on my side right now."
I stared at the glowing screen, then slowly closed my eyes. In an instant, I understood the depth of her agony. She wasn't just crying for me. She was crying for herself. Her father hadn't just manipulated his wife. He had systematically used his own daughter as a pawn. The realization had completely shattered something inside her.
Ashley covered her face with her hands, her voice muffled by her palms. I actually defended him. I sat quietly beside her, letting her process the weight of it. I actually blamed you, Mum. I remained still, offering no judgment. I honestly believed you were the problem. The intense guilt in her voice was heartbreaking, because Ashley isn't a cruel or selfish person. She isn't malicious. She had simply placed her trust in the wrong person, a mistake thousands of people make every single day. Yet she was carrying it as a personal failure. I gently reached over and took her hands, pulling them away from her face. Look at me, Ashley. She forced her eyes to meet mine, tears immediately spilling over her cheeks again. I'm so incredibly sorry, she whispered, the words barely audible. I'm so sorry, Mom.
I offered a gentle, reassuring smile. Not because I hadn't been deeply hurt by her distance, but because I understood the nature of the deception. I know, sweetie. No, she said, shaking her head fiercely. You don't understand. More tears fell. I actually believed his stories.
The raw pain in her voice was immense. For months, Ashley had been living inside a meticulously crafted illusion. Now that illusion had collapsed, leaving her standing entirely in the rubble. I remembered that exact feeling of complete devastation. I had lived through it myself, just from a different seat. Ashley, listen to me, I said, locking eyes with her. You are not responsible for your father's choices. The statement seemed to catch her off guard. I should have trusted you from the start.
I shook my head firmly. You simply trusted a parent you loved. The distinction was absolutely vital, because shame thrives in self-blame, and I refused to let Ashley carry a burden of disgrace that belonged entirely to Gregory. We sat together in silence for a long time, watching people walk through the park, listening to the distant hum of traffic, the birds and the steady flow of life moving around us.
Finally, Ashley spoke again, her voice quieter now. Did you know about those specific messages?
I shook my head. No, I didn't.
The answer surprised her. You didn't know? No, I replied, offering a sad smile. But I already knew enough.
Ashley stared down at the grass beneath her shoes. When did you first realize it?
It wasn't a question with a simple single answer, because betrayal rarely arrives in a grand explosion. It arrives in stages and fragments, 1,000 tiny epiphanies that slowly clarify the picture. So, I told her everything. Not every single clinical detail, but enough to let her see the entire tapestry. The strange behaviour, the growing financial red flags, Linda's urgent warning, the investigation, the affair, his systematic plans, and the endless lies. All of it. Ashley listened in absolute silence, occasionally wiping away tears, occasionally shaking her head, and sometimes just staring blankly into the distance. By the time I finished speaking, she looked completely undone. Not because the facts of the affair were entirely new, but because she finally comprehended just how much I had carried entirely alone. For the first time, she saw the complete picture, and it was entirely unvarnished. I left you completely alone through all of it. That sentence nearly broke my composure, because that had been the single hardest part of the entire year. It wasn't Gregory's betrayal. It was the isolation. It was the feeling that my own daughter had chosen his fabricated version of reality over mine. I squeezed her hand tightly. You were just trying to do what you thought was right, Ashley.
She shook her head. No, I wasn't.
Yes, you were, I countered, ensuring she met my gaze. You were trying to protect your family. New tears surfaced as she finally understood a profound truth. The exact same instinct that drove her to defend Gregory was the very instinct that made her a good person. He had simply exploited it. The distinction made all the difference in the world. After another long, peaceful silence, Ashley asked a question I never expected to hear. Can you ever forgive me, Mom? The answer left my lips without a single moment of hesitation. No conditions, no pauses, no reservations. I already have.
She stared at me, thoroughly stunned. You already have?
I smiled warmly. Ashley, you are my daughter. The tears returned instantly, but this time they were entirely different. They weren't tears of guilt or devastation. They were tears of pure relief. The kind of cry that happens when someone extends a grace you firmly believed you didn't deserve. We embraced again, holding on to each other longer and tighter this time. For the first time in months, I felt the unmistakable beginning of real healing. We weren't completely cured, far from it, but it was a start, a genuine start. Walking back toward the parking lot, Ashley slipped her arm through mine. The simple, familiar gesture nearly moved me to tears, because it felt so comfortable, so normal, and so right. It was a connection we hadn't shared in a very long time. Before getting into her car, she turned back to me. "What happens now, Mum?" I looked out toward the horizon, at the future, and everything still waiting for us. "The truth will just keep doing what it does." Ashley offered a watery smile, and for the first time in months, it reached her eyes completely. Watching her drive away, I realized a monumental truth. For nearly a year, Gregory had been ruthlessly trying to strip things away from me. Money, trust, security, and family. He had briefly succeeded with some of it, but none of it was permanent, because the single most important asset had survived intact: the bond between my daughter and me. And today, the bond was far stronger than it had been in years. What neither Ashley nor I realized at the time was that Gregory's world was collapsing at an even faster rate. Because at the exact same moment he lost his daughter, he was losing Vanessa too. Very soon, he would lose the final piece of reality he believed he still controlled. His tomorrow. The final legal decree arrived 6 weeks later. By that point, most of the true damage had already been done. Not legal damage, but personal destruction. The kind of fractures no court of law can ever fully repair. Gregory had permanently lost Ashley's trust. He had lost Vanessa's presence, and he had completely destroyed the reputable image he spent a lifetime building. The legal machinery was simply catching up to the decisions reality had already finalized. Still, the ruling mattered immensely because actions have consequences, and for the very first time in his life, Gregory was facing his unvarnished. I remember sitting in Michael's office when the official documents were delivered. The atmosphere felt surprisingly tranquil. No celebration, no triumphant cheers, just a profound quiet. Michael reviewed the paperwork thoroughly before looking up at me. "It's officially over, Theresa." The words landed softly in the room. "It's over." What an incredibly simple phrase for an experience that had consumed nearly a year of my life. I took the documents and began to read through the court's terms. The outcome was fair, not dramatic, but entirely equitable. The court took a very dim view of Gregory's financial maneuvers. Draining the joint account, the systematic disclosure failures, the glaring inconsistencies, and the forged document. None of it had done his case any favors. The judge ordered several strict financial adjustments. Specific funds had to be fully accounted for. Certain asset transfers required legal explanation, and the arrogant assumptions Gregory had relied upon vanished into thin air. But the most critical outcome wasn't the monetary distribution, it was the absolute accountability. For the first time, Gregory couldn't charm or manipulate his way out of the situation. Reality was now printed in black and white legal text. As I finished reading, Michael offered a genuine smile. "You protected yourself, Theresa." I looked down at the paperwork, then out the window. Months ago, I would have interpreted that statement through a lens of immense guilt, feeling as though self-protection was inherently selfish. Now, I understood it was simply necessary, because no one else was going to do it for me. Not Gregory, not fate, not luck. Only me. A few days after the final ruling, Ashley invited me out for lunch. Our relationship was continuing to heal in a slow, entirely natural way, with neither of us forcing anything. That is how real recovery operates. It doesn't happen all at once. It unfolds across dozens of normal conversations, quiet moments, and conscious choices to stay connected. We met at a small bistro near her office. Halfway through our meal, she paused and asked a question she'd been holding on to. "Have you spoken to Dad lately?" I shook my head. "No, I haven't." Ashley looked slightly uncomfortable, letting out a soft sigh. "He isn't doing well, Mum." The statement failed to trigger any real emotional reaction in me. Not because I was malicious, but because I had fully accepted that Gregory's choices were entirely his to carry now. For decades, I had stepped in to rescue him from his own consequences, fixing problems, smoothing over conflicts, and engineering a false stability. Those days were permanently over. Still, I let her speak. Apparently, Vanessa had walked away from him completely. Not a temporary separation or a conditional break, but a total departure. Gregory had sacrificed his entire life for that relationship, only to watch it turn to complete ash. According to Ashley, the breakup hadn't been a dramatic explosion. No screaming matches or public scandals. Vanessa had simply reached a point where she could no longer believe a single word that came out of his mouth. To be completely honest, I understood her perspective perfectly. Once trust is systematically dismantled, rebuilding it is nearly impossible, especially when the destruction is entirely self-inflicted. The poetic irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. Gregory lost his marriage because of his lies, and then he lost his affair for the exact same reason. The pattern was glaringly obvious, yet he remained completely blind to it. A few weeks later, I ran into Gregory entirely by accident. We crossed paths outside a local grocery store, not in a sterile courtroom or a high-end lawyer's office, but in an ordinary parking lot. Life always seems to select the most mundane locations for significant encounters. I was loading grocery bags into the back of my car when I heard my name called. Theresa. I turned around. For a split second, I barely recognized the man standing there. Not because his physical appearance had altered dramatically, but because his presence had completely collapsed. The unshakable confidence was entirely gone. The arrogance had vanished, and even the underlying anger seemed to have burned out. All that remained was an overwhelming, deep-seated exhaustion. Gregory stood there awkwardly, looking as though he wasn't entirely sure why he had approached me, or perhaps as if he had finally comprehended the magnitude of his losses. He looked incredibly small, not physically, but spiritually, like a man buckling under the sheer weight of his own decisions. Neither of us spoke immediately. Then he took a deep, heavy breath. "I'm sorry, Theresa." The apology surprised me, not because I never expected to hear the words, but because I realized I no longer needed to hear them to feel validated. I just looked at him, the man I had married, the partner I built a life with, and the person who shattered that life without a second thought. "I'm sorry too, Gregory," I replied softly. His expression shifted, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. "Sorry?" I nodded slowly. "I'm sorry things turned out this way." The response seemed to baffle him entirely. Perhaps he expected anger, bitterness, or a sharp rebuke. But the reality was far simpler. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger requires an immense amount of emotional energy, and I had already spent more than enough energy on Gregory. He looked down at the asphalt, asking a question I think he had been harboring for months. "Do you think we could ever—"
He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I understood exactly what he was hinting at. A second chance, a reconciliation, a return to some comfortable version of the life we used to share.
I considered the question honestly, not for his sake, but for mine. Because after everything I had survived, I owed myself absolute honesty. The answer surfaced effortlessly, carrying no malice. "No, Gregory." Gregory closed his eyes briefly, nodding slightly, as if he had known the answer before he even asked. "I figured." The deep sadness in his voice sounded entirely genuine. For the first time in a very long time, I actually believed him. Not because he deserved sympathy, but because true regret had finally caught up to him. Not regret over getting caught, but a profound sorrow for everything he had permanently thrown away. Unfortunately, some lessons simply arrived too late to matter. We spoke for a few more minutes. Nothing dramatic or emotional, just two people entering the later chapters of their lives, discussing the wreckage left behind. Finally, he gave a slight nod. "Take care of yourself, Theresa." I offered a small smile. "You too, Gregory." With that, he turned around and walked away. There was no dramatic music or cinematic resolution, just the fading sound of footsteps disappearing across the asphalt. The final chapter of a 38-year marriage, closing in complete silence. Exactly how most things end in reality. Driving home, a profound calm washed over me because I understood a monumentally important distinction. Forgiveness does not require reconciliation. People constantly confuse those two entirely separate concepts. I had forgiven Gregory, not for his benefit, but entirely for mine. Carrying hatred is completely exhausting, and harboring bitterness drains your spirit. I refused to spend the remaining chapters of my life carrying that heavy burden. But forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. It doesn't magically restore trust, and it cannot rebuild 38 years of history. Some bridges are burned so completely they can never be crossed again, and that is perfectly okay. Later that evening, I sat on the porch watching the sun go down. Over the past year, the routine had become incredibly meaningful to me. The sky glowed in brilliant shades of amber and gold, and the neighborhood kids rode their bikes down the street. Life was moving forward beautifully, ordinarily, and unpredictably. My phone vibrated on the table. A text from Ashley. It was just a short message. "Dinner this weekend?" I smiled instantly, typing out a quick response. "Absolutely."
Setting the phone down, I realized the one thing Gregory would never comprehend. His biggest loss wasn't the money, or the property, or the legal rulings, or even the marriage itself. His biggest loss was connection. While Gregory had systematically severed his ties, my connections had grown significantly stronger, especially the most vital thread of all, the bond between a mother and her daughter. And that unshakable bond was exactly what would carry me into the next chapter of my life.
A chapter that, after a very long time, belonged entirely to me. 1 year after Gregory drained our joint savings account, I stood on the deck of a small house, overlooking a pristine, quiet lake. The water stretched out endlessly before me, calm, peaceful, and entirely still. For the very first time in a long time, my life felt exactly the same way. If someone had told me 2 years ago that my marriage would dissolve, my family would fracture, and I would be completely rebuilding my future at 63 years old, I would have laughed. Not because it was impossible, but because it felt entirely unimaginable. Yet life has a way of forcing us into chapters we never planned on writing. The true difference lies in whether we choose to remain trapped inside those pages or find the courage to turn the leaf.
I chose to turn the page.
The months following the final divorce decree weren't easy. People often mistakenly assume that once legal justice is delivered, the emotional pain instantly vanishes. It doesn't work that way. Emotional recovery doesn't follow a court calendar. The hearings were over, the paperwork was finalized, and the arguments had ceased. But a deep grief remained. I wasn't grieving for Gregory. I was grieving for the life I thought I had, the future I had envisioned, and the fact that 38 years of history looked completely different when viewed through the unvarnished lens of truth. Some mornings I would wake up and reflexively reach for the other side of the mattress, only to remember no one was there. Other days, I'd drive past a restaurant where we used to celebrate anniversaries, and a wave of old memories would surface out of nowhere. Healing isn't a straight, predictable line. Some days feel incredibly strong, while others bring an unexpected ache. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, a shift occurred. The pain stopped controlling my choices, and the moment that happened, new possibilities began taking up space. One of the largest choices I faced involved our marital home. That house contained decades of our history: birthday parties, Christmas mornings, graduation celebrations, family meals, laughter, tears, and a lifetime of living. But it also harbored a deep pain. Every room reminded me of the betrayal. Every hallway echoed with the secrets, and every corner held a version of myself that no longer existed. Finally, I realized an undeniable truth. A house can hold an immense amount of meaning, but it should never become prison.
So I sold it, not out of hatred, but because I was completely ready to let go of the past.
Ashley was by my side through the entire process, a presence that meant far more to me than she will ever fully realize. A year ago, we could barely manage a brief conversation without an undercurrent of intense stress. Now we spent weekends exploring new properties, sharing lunches, talking with total transparency, and laughing genuinely again. Our connection hadn't just been repaired. In many ways, it was stronger than it had ever been, because it was built entirely on a foundation of unvarnished honesty rather than assumptions and appearances. Pure honesty. This small lake house had been Ashley's favourite from the start. The moment we pulled into the driveway, a brilliant smile lit up her face. "Mum, this place feels like it was custom-made for you." I smiled. "What exactly does that mean?" She gestured toward the property. "The water, the trees, this incredible quiet." She shrugged gently. It just feels entirely peaceful.
For decades, I had poured so much of my energy into managing everyone else's lives that I had completely forgotten how incredibly precious pure peace truly is. So I bought it, not because it was extravagant or designed to impress anyone, but because it represented a completely fresh start, and that was exactly what I needed.
Around that same time, another unexpected opportunity surfaced. Throughout the divorce proceedings, I encountered several women who were facing situations remarkably similar to mine. Some had experienced systemic financial manipulation. Others had lived under total emotional control. And many had simply spent decades operating under the false assumption that someone else would always protect them. Their stories broke my heart. Not because they were weak, but because they were incredibly strong women who had simply never been taught the vital importance of financial independence. I saw a reflection of my own history in so many of them. One afternoon, following a local support group meeting, a woman approached me hesitantly. She looked entirely overwhelmed. "I just wish someone had taught me how to understand these documents 20 years ago, Theresa." Her words echoed in my mind for weeks, eventually sparking a definitive idea. Utilizing a portion of my personal investments and the legacy my mother had left me, I established a small community initiative. It wasn't a massive corporate venture, just a grassroots program designed to help older women master financial literacy, asset protection, retirement preparedness, and true independent management. The first workshop drew 12 women, the second attracted 23. By the third session, nearly 50 women filled the room. Every single story I listened to served as a powerful reminder of why this work mattered so deeply. One woman proudly shared that she had finally opened her own independent retirement account. Another had thoroughly audited legal records she hadn't looked at in years. A third caught financial discrepancies in her accounts before they could spiral into a complete catastrophe. Every small victory felt incredibly meaningful, because true empowerment isn't about the currency itself. It's about knowledge, self-assurance, and having a choice. My mother understood that truth implicitly, and now so did I. Sometimes while leading those workshops, I find myself thinking about her lasting legacy, the wisdom she shared, and that manila folder she handed me years ago. At the time, I assumed she was simply gifting me a sum of money. In reality, she was gifting me protection, a future, and a vital lesson, the exact lesson that ultimately saved my life. As for Gregory, I catch occasional updates about him through Ashley. Not many, and not frequently, which is truly for the best. He moved into a much smaller apartment, took an earlier retirement than he originally planned, and keeps to himself for the most part. I have never once gloated over his circumstances. Contrary to what some might assume, watching a person's life collapse brings zero fulfillment, especially when that person is someone you loved deeply for decades. But I have never once regretted my choices. Compassion and absolute accountability can exist in the exact same space. You can sincerely wish someone well while firmly refusing to ever let them access your life to hurt you again. That realization completely revolutionized my world. Yet the most meaningful transformation remains my relationship with Ashley. A few evenings ago, she and her husband brought the kids out to the lake house. We sat out on the deck, watching the sun dip below the water while the grandkids played down by the dock, their laughter drifting across the yard. The entire scene felt profoundly beautiful and beautifully ordinary. At one point, Ashley sat down in the chair next to mine. Neither of us said a word for several minutes, just watching the colours bleed across the sky. Then she spoke softly, her eyes fixed on the water. "You know, Mom, I came so incredibly close to losing you completely." I turned to look at her. She wasn't looking back. She was just reflecting, processing, and absorbing the history. I reached over and gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. "No, sweetie," I said, smiling warmly as she turned her head toward me. "You found your way back." Tears immediately filled her eyes, but this time they weren't tears of sorrow or crushing guilt. They were tears of pure gratitude. I think a few matching tears found their way down my cheeks too, because a family isn't defined by a flawless history. It's defined by what manages to survive the storms. And somehow, despite everything we lived through, our connection survived. As the final light disappeared below the horizon, my mind drifted back to the day Gregory emptied our savings account. In that moment, he genuinely believed he was stealing my entire future. He believed he had won the game. What he never understood, and what he never will, is that my future was never contained inside a bank account. My future was my resilience, my preparation, my independent choices, and my unshakable capacity to rebuild my life from scratch. Is money important? Absolutely. But currency alone can never engineer pure peace. It cannot manufacture character. It cannot buy real love. And it absolutely cannot construct a meaningful life. Those things surface from a far deeper well. Standing on my deck, looking out over the quiet lake today, I don't spend a single second thinking about what was taken from me. I think entirely about what survived. And as it turns out, the things that stayed are infinitely more valuable than anything Gregory ever tried to steal. One of the hardest lessons I had to learn is that trust should never completely replace vigilance. Loving someone deeply doesn't mean blinding yourself to obvious warning flags, and supporting a partner should never require abandoning your own independence. Protecting yourself is never an act of selfishness. For decades, I operated under the assumption that a marriage could survive on blind trust alone. I ultimately learned that a healthy relationship requires both trust and absolute accountability. When one partner remains honest while the other operates in deception, trust stops being a foundation and simply becomes a weapon. I also learned the vital, life-changing importance of financial literacy. No matter what chapter of life you are in, every single woman deserves to understand her financial standing, her legal rights, her assets, and her choices. Knowledge brings an undeniable confidence. Confidence delivers true freedom, and freedom provides absolute security. Most importantly, I learned that a betrayal does not have the power to define the remainder of your life. People will let you down, relationships will end, and plans will shatter. But none of those circumstances have the power to destroy who you are, unless you stop believing in your own capacity to start over. True healing takes time, forgiveness takes patience, and rebuilding requires courage. But every magnificent new chapter begins the exact moment you choose to take that first step forward. If my journey resonated with you in any way, I would love to read your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had to completely rebuild your life after a profound betrayal? What was the most vital lesson you carried away from the experience? Please share your history below. Your words might be the exact source of hope someone needs to read today. If you want to keep exploring these emotional journeys of resilience, healing, and justice, please like, subscribe, and join our community. Thank you for listening, and remember, you are never alone in your strength.